Hey guys, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to go through a ladder stitch for faux fur. So I've had this question quite a lot. So yeah, I finally got around to doing a video. So what you want to do is get some good quality thread, and I use a needle with a large eyelet in it, just so it makes it easier to thread the actual thread through. But you can use any little sewing needle that you have around. I just prefer to use this one. And the thread that I use is Gutermann, and I really like this thread. It's pretty strong. I've used all kinds of thread, and if I come to the conclusion that cheap thread is cheap for a reason, it breaks a lot. So if you want a video about different threads and stuff that you can get, let me know and I'll try and make one as well. So what you want to do is just tie off your thread onto the faux fur. And I do this by just tying a couple of loop knots on the back side of the faux fur. And it's basically just putting the needle down through and then back through about a couple of millimeters apart, and then threading that thread through the loop that you get. So once you've got a strong enough knot, I usually give it a little bit of a tug just to know that the thread isn't going to come off. So only a light tug, because you will actually break the thread if you tug too hard, which I have done many times. Alright, so what we want to do is, I'm sewing a tail here. So the tail needs to be enclosed at the top so it has a little peak. So what I do is fold the fur piece around, and then all you do is thread the needle through and back to the other side with about a 2 to 3 millimeter gap, and then what you want to do is just pull it through, and basically that fabric ends up turning itself over on itself, so it's basically hiding that cut seam. So when I'm starting it off, I like to just do one ladder stitch and then do another one on the other side, and then threading that thread through the loop that you can see here. And then I give it a good tug. Remember, not too hard, because you will break the thread. And then because this is faux fur and it will be sort of manipulated a lot and stretched and everything, I like to actually tie off a knot here through both sides of the fur, just so it actually adheres and sticks to itself, and that way it's a little bit stronger. And always just being careful of where that pile is actually going, so you don't get any of that trapped. So that's really the main difference that you get when sewing faux fur and a felt type fabric, is you need to keep an eye on where the pile is. So now I'm just going ahead and sewing back and forth, making sure that that faux fur has curled back on itself and that there is a nice even closure between the seams. And because this is the end of a tail, I tend to pull it a little bit tighter, just so it creates sort of an arrow shape, if that makes sense. So it will look like the end of a tail. If you've seen like a cat's tail or something, it's usually a little pointy. So I tend to tie it off a bit tighter, but I definitely don't pull too tight. Now, once I've closed up that seam, I tend to go back over, just because you have an armature inside these tail pieces. So when you use a wire armature, it tends to poke through if you haven't sewn it up properly, or if there's a little gap. So I like to make sure that it is extra tight and extra sealed shut. So I go back over again just to make sure there's no more gaps where that armature can poke through. And because this is a tail tip, you also want to make sure that you haven't, plastered down any of that pile, and that you can actually train the pile to go into a peak. So I usually like to give it a comb with even my needle, just something with a pointy tip that you can get in there and just sort of manipulate that pile. And then when we get to the edge of that end of the tail piece, I like to tie it off again, just to make sure that everything is secure and it won't come apart. So once I've done that, I can then go and run for my ladder stitch. And I usually stick my finger in between where the tail end meets, just so I have a good grip on the two faux fur sides, and that way I can actually get the needle easily in between both sides of the faux fur pieces. I usually use my thumb to keep the pile separated from the edge. It's a lot easier to see what you're doing, and a lot easier to get that thread in between as well. So when you work with felt or something that doesn't have a pile, you don't have to actually worry about any of that problem. So you don't have to keep an eye on what the pile is doing. You don't have to comb things out. It's just like a straight ladder stitch from back and forth. But with faux fur, you do have to keep an eye on how the pile is behaving and where it's going, and you also have to keep an eye on how tight you're pulling the thread. So sometimes when you pull the thread too tight and you're doing a tail piece like this one, especially a thin piece, it tends to curl around on itself. So that's also just something to keep an eye on, is how tight you're pulling the thread. Try not to pull it too tight, because like I said, it will end up curling around on itself and twisting. But you have to pull it as a certain tightness anyway, so the fabric actually closes up. So you'll get the hang of it once you do a couple of times of a ladder stitch. You'll get the hang of it and know what tension is best. So I like to keep my ladder stitch pretty close together, because this will be under a lot of stress from all the posing that my dolls do. So I tend to do the same short distance between each ladder stitch, and keeping the stitch about 2 to 3 millimeters in length, and I just end up putting the stitch right next to where the previous stitch is, just so it has more places to close, so there's no more gaps. So faux fur can be pretty forgiving as well. So if you don't have the straightest of stitches, faux fur is pretty forgiving and will cover most of that. But when you're doing a pattern, say for this tail, how it has a white tip and a blue rest of the tail, you need to make sure that your lines will match up. So you don't want to have too much white onto the blue area. So you want to definitely make sure you're keeping your stitches the same size on each side, so it will match up when it comes to the different colored lines. And again, you will get the hang of this the more you sew, so practice always makes perfect. I can't recommend practicing enough. There's nothing I can say or do to make it perfect. You just have to practice and keep trying. So with this particular tail, I'm actually only sewing it halfway past that white tail tip, and then I'm going to be gluing the rest of the tail pieces. This is because the doll that I'm making this for has 6 tails, so the tails have to be quite small. So I decided to glue half of them, just because the tails have something to adhere to and don't sort of flop around or anything. So I'll be stopping my ladder stitch around about here. So when I'm going to tie off my ladder stitch, I usually end up doing 3 different techniques to make sure everything's secured. So what I do is I finish off my ladder stitch as normal, and then I will thread it through again, just so it closes and will actually stay closed. And then I do it again on the other side. And then once I've done that, I will then go ahead and just thread the stitch through both sides of the faux fur piece, and then I will tie it off and thread the needle through the loop that you create. And I do this a couple of times just so I make sure it is secure, because again, this piece will be under a lot of stress, so I don't want that thread to snap or break or anything. And once I'm happy with that, I then go ahead and thread that whole needle through a little bit lower in the piece. And then what I do is I cut off that thread on the fur side and let it just hang back in your piece. So that way there's no chance of your thread feeding back through your knot, and everything is tightly secured. So then I go back and just check that I haven't secured anything down or flattened any of that pile down. So I just go ahead and pick out anything that I feel needs to be picked out. And it's the same thing, whatever you sew, you have to pick out any pile pieces. If you use a sewing machine, you have to pick it out. If you hand sew it, you have to pick it out. And I like to use a little fur pick. I will look at stocking these in my shop if anyone is interested, but I just use this fur pick to pick anything out. And that's how you do a ladder stitch for faux fur. So that's it from me today, guys. I hope you liked the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. If you have any video requests, you can leave in the comments down below. You can also check me out on Instagram and Facebook at Creatures of Nat, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!